Director of Programs for the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Thank you for joining us again for another excellent webinar, a fascinating topic, a great book, and a wonderful author. We're delighted to cover this evening A Sleeper Agent, the Atomic Spy in America Who Got Away, with award-winning author Anne Hagedorn. Just so you know, we're delighted to have back moderating the conversation for this evening is my former colleague and our wonderful former programs manager, Viridiana Otamendi, who has sadly moved on to New York's gain at our loss, but we're delighted to have her back this evening for this interview with Anne. And to introduce Anne, I just want to let you know, Anne is a former staff writer for the Wall Street Journal. She's an award-winning author of 6 narrative nonfiction books that embrace a broad range of topics, which are widely reviewed in multiple newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, NPR, Time, Smithsonian, the New York Book Review of Books, Huffington Post, Chicago Tribune, and the Washington Post. Hagedorn has taught writing at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism and at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Her previous books include Wild Ride, Ransom, Beyond the River, and Savage Peace. Hagedorn is a graduate of Denison University, the University of Michigan, and Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. And before we begin tonight, just want to let you know, as always, please feel free to ask a question using the Q&A tab. You can type those questions in down here. It's a tab at the bottom right of your screen. And to let you know about our 2 upcoming events, they are in person. We're delighted to be getting back to in-person events. If you can join us on Thursday, August 12th, we're hosting a program on the impacts of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. That'll be with retired former Colonel Christopher Kolenda. He was the first American officer to command units fighting against the Taliban, and then shortly afterwards, 2 or 3 years later, to be an official representative of the United States in the Defense Department negotiating with the Taliban. And joining him will be an excellent perspective from the Afghan perspective. It will be Belkis Ahmadi. She was a former nurse and head administrator for a trauma hospital in Kabul during the last years of the Soviet invasion and withdrawal, and then the ensuing civil war, and left shortly after the Taliban came to power. And then since 2001, she spent many years on the ground trying to rebuild Afghanistan with the USAID, the Red Cross, and other organizations. And then also the end of August, hopefully you can join us. We're having an excellent program on August 26th, and that will be the former acting US ambassador to China, Ambassador David Rank, and we'll be discussing China, the United States, and what the outlook lies in regards to 2 of them, and I suppose competition and perhaps cooperation going forward. So again, we're delighted to have you all join us, and thank you very much. Anne, I'll let you take it away, and we're looking forward to a great discussion.
Thank you, Ronan. It's an honor to be here. And before I start specifically talking about Sleeper Agent, let me just say it's my job as a narrative nonfiction writer to use the art of storytelling to engage general readers about meaningful issues. My quest is always to find the compelling narrative, of course, that will bring alive for the reader all issues and individuals at the core of the book's topic. The criteria for choosing topics: they must have significance, possibly be in danger of falling through the cracks of history, must be doable research-wise, must have literary potential, must have general reader appeal, and must arouse my writerly passions. So first you choose the topic, right? Then you find the best narrative. That's the usual sequence. But this time I discovered a remarkable story first, one that grabbed me from the start. And it all started with an interview I was doing with a 92-year-old gentleman in 2006 for a book idea I was fleshing out and trying to find the best narrative to bring the issue alive. And he knew I had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, and toward the end of the interview, he asked if I knew about the secret site in Dayton tied to the highly secretive the Manhattan Project. A while ago, he said somebody had told him that a Soviet spy worked there during World War II and lived in the same community where I had spent my childhood. For a week or so after the interview, I continued my pursuit of details for the other topic, but I was brimming with curiosity, of course, and matched with skepticism, I have to say. I took some time off to explore what the gentleman had told me, but I had no name for the alleged spy, and I actually had no no details to back it up. I wasn't sure that it wasn't anything more than a rumor. So I took some weeks off to make some calls, dive into some research, and I soon found actually a New York Times article written after Vladimir Putin had given a posthumous award to the spy. So I found the spy's name. I evaluated what seemed to be known, what was clearly unknown and would have to be discovered in order to flesh it out into a biography, and also a long list of where there might be primary sources, much needed primary sources. So next came what I call the flight plan, a schedule for the research, and then gaining wisdom from the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for FBI reports and began the trips to archives nationwide, first to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, where an archivist whom I heard from just a few days ago helped me tremendously, and that was the major turning point. And from the start, I have to say, there isn't a single person in my life who would say I barely took a day off from the beginning of that flight plan, so to speak. And it was an amazing adventure of finding letters, journals, postcards, news clips, yearbooks, photos, maps, tax records, ship manifests, passports, arrest records, application forms, even inscriptions in books, and thousands upon thousands of pages of FBI reports. And there was the regimen, of course, of reading applicable secondary sources in the numerous domains, as you'll see when you read the book, from the 20th century anti-Semitism in Russia and America to the Soviet espionage tactics and networks in 1930s and 1940s America, to the manufacture of the element polonium, and among many others, the timelines of the making of the atomic bombs in both the United States and the Soviet Union, all in the pursuit of putting together the pieces of the life of a Soviet military intelligence officer who, as a US Army corporal, had full US security clearance in the top secret World War II project to build the first atomic bomb. So the who and the when were doable on the long must-do list of challenges. I was confident about that. But for the book to be a true biography, the why, the what, and the how had to be uncovered. And indeed, Sleeper Agent is a biography of a Soviet spy born and raised in Iowa and known for many things, but largely among friends and former colleagues. He was known to charm everyone he met. He loved baseball. He was a skilled shortstop. He could reel off the history and stats of every big league pitcher. He played bridge. He was a fan of Walt Whitman, and he could recite William Wordsworth Longfellow's poems. He was, by several accounts, quite the ladies' man. He obviously blended in well into American culture, and all the while he was sending atomic secrets to Moscow to help speed up the creation of their own atomic bomb. So among the most obvious and fascinating details is perhaps what's in the subtitle of the book, the fact that he was never caught. Like all spy stories, the book gives readers the expected intrigue of some espionage details, the code names, the various cover shops in Manhattan, the apartments in the Bronx, where several of the spies that George Koval, our spy here, worked with. And the handler and his suspicious routines. I had quite an adventure finding the addresses and then visiting the premises, even interviewing current owners about the history of the former cover shops and measuring distances between certain cover shops and other locations that had been mentioned in FBI files about where meetings had been confirmed. For example, the main cover shop was in Chelsea in Manhattan on West 23rd Street, and it was a 7-minute walk from the Flatiron Building, where on the 7th floor there were also meetings. But the book really does go beyond that. For the biography, delves into the psychology of the spy, showing the hopes, fears, and beliefs that spurred his decisions and accomplishments. Everyone's life must have meaning, right? And I wanted to unveil the people and events that shaped the meaning in George Koval's life, to immerse the reader into the historical context in which the spy functioned, to basically deepen the themes and significance of a typical spy story and weave in what I always call the human constants, speak to the human condition. Like in the first paragraph of the book, which, by the way, I write all my first paragraphs in the reading room at the New York Public Library. It's a tradition, so a wonderful place to go to do that. Sometimes the entire prologues or first chapters. The first paragraph of the book, speaking to the human condition. Sometimes the clues that should have been warnings are lost in a blur, only to be seen in hindsight. Caught in the need to move ahead, most people rush like speeding trains past the truths and half-truths tucked into the terrain they thought they knew. And so it would be for a man and a woman one evening in 1948 at New York City's Grand Central Palace, each soon to learn the timeless cost of missing clues. After reading an early copy of Sleeper Agent, a good friend of mine, Nick Clooney, came up with a very important insight. He said that Koval's biography indeed takes the reader beyond a typical spy story by bringing alive, basically personifying the Cold War battle of the American dream versus the communist workers' paradise. And one of the Russian scholars knowledgeable about Koval wrote to me a few days ago saying, quote, George Koval's life journey through the 20th century's American and Russian destinies and his work as an intelligence agent had such an impact on world history that his personality and fate will long be the subject of study in both Russia and the United States, unquote. But Koval's story also shows the expertise and determination of Russian military intelligence and how we've often underestimated Russian capabilities in technology and science. In one of the later chapters of the book, I think it's the closing chapter of the book, when Koval has returned to Russia, to the Soviet Union, there is a discussion of the U.S. embassy in Moscow. Or what happened in the mid-1980s at the discovery of bugs in the structure of the embassy. And the testimony at that time of former Defense Secretary and CIA Chief James Schlesinger, I'm sure it was in 1985, was that the culprit is American complacency, the tendency to assume that the Russians are technically inferior to us, unquote. And by the way, in the testimony, he called the embassy the best bugged building ever built, unquote. The book also exposes the backlash of bigotry, the persistence of prejudice throughout history, basically the human cost of oppression. Though his self-designed tapestry of lies and half-truths depicts a true traitor to his nation, his nation of origin, Koval was also a very dedicated scientist, and he was a resilient survivor of anti-Semitism in both Russia and America. He was someone who knew and had witnessed the human costs of oppression. Another important point perhaps to make here is that this is also a spy story that transcends the debates about the scale of Soviet espionage in wartime America, and hopefully turns the reader's attention to the fact that scapegoating, opportunism, and bigotry blurred the vision of several parts of what was truly happening regarding the Soviet spy networks. For example, J. Edgar Hoover seemed to think that all members of the Communist Party USA had to be spies. But look at Koval. He played bridge. He belonged to a bowling league, not the Communist Party USA. He did not mingle with communists in New York or anywhere he lived in America. And he did mingle with his scientific peers. He belonged to an electrical engineering fraternity. And he did not mingle with his quote unquote fellow travelers, as his espionage peers were called. He simply blended in. The book answers some long lingering questions about Koval's life. It brings to light many new details. It reveals why he was undetected, and it shows there were no coincidences. A source of mine many years ago when I was at the Wall Street Journal, actually he's a former prosecutor in New York, told me when I asked him about the best ways to investigate, he said, use timelines and chronologies and never accept coincidences. In this case, one good example of that was Koval's enrollment at Columbia shortly after he returned to America as a Red Army trained spy. That fact was simply a line in one of the FBI files, a line without any context. He got a B, by the way, in the course. Anyhow, it's a great example of what could be a detail of little significance, but with some study, mainly timelines about what was happening then in nuclear physics, it becomes far more important than just someone taking a chemistry course at an Ivy League school because he loved science or he wanted to make friends at his new home in New York City. To be sure, by the time of Koval's enrollment in 1941, Columbia University had become a magnet for some of the most highly regarded physicists and chemists in the world, some destined to play stellar roles in the upcoming production of the first atomic bomb. And there had been a very detailed front page story in the New York Times in May 1940 about what was happening at Columbia in physics, an article that Koval's handler would definitely have seen. So, take a fact, dig further, establish some timelines, and then the truth begins to surface. One other example I'll mention here is about Koval's job at Oak Ridge. He worked in two sites of the Manhattan Project, Oak Ridge and Dayton, Ohio, and he worked as a health physicist. So it was known, it was not hard to find out, where he had been in the Manhattan Project, but exactly what did he do there? What was his daily routine? How would that affect his access to top secret information? He was a health physicist, and health physicists measured levels of radiation, contamination, of course, and such work required routine access to confidential and secret information. In fact, most, if not all, information pertaining to health physics during Koval's tenure at Oak Ridge was classified. Health physicists had to learn the basic chemical properties of all the radioactive materials they were monitoring. They were asked to be present whenever repair work was done on any equipment at the plants, and no shipment could leave the site of Oak Ridge without the approval of the health physics department. Also, the health physicists conducted routine surveys of all offices and labs as they checked for signs of contamination. And I mean, think about that. This was the job of a Soviet spy. 3 important steps for the health physics workers were always noted in their training materials. Know all operations in your area. Be alert to all changes. Make thorough surveys, unquote. Finding such details are what I always call the aha moments, and there were numerous examples of them in the process of piecing together Koval's life. At the National Archives, I actually shouted aha, I think, at one point when I discovered a very helpful 250-page file. And I must have been humming ahas when I walked the streets of Manhattan and the Bronx to map out where Koval and his quote unquote fellow travelers had worked and lived. But right now, I must close this short talk with a few comments about my hopes for the book. For one thing, please, when you read the book, do read the acknowledgements and the notes intro. There are a lot of interesting little details about the process in there. And my hopes are that Sleeper Agent will deepen the reader's understanding of the intriguing psychology of a spy and of the timeless cost of oppression, and that it will be helpful to future researchers, of course, and contribute to the step-by-step process of prying open the closed chapters in the story of Soviet espionage in America. So thank you very much. Just a few comments. Hope it's helpful.
Yeah, very helpful. So thank you very much for that introduction. And again, here's the cover. It's a wonderful, shocking, true story. So my colleague just added the link for you to purchase the book, which is already a bestseller on Amazon. So congratulations again.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know that. Thank you.
So yeah, I'm going to be following up with some questions, and then towards the last part, we're going to go to the audience's questions. So I would like to start with what you mentioned about these anti-Semitism, both in the US and the Soviet Union. So Koval, as you mentioned, was born and raised in Iowa. However, afterwards, he's taken back to the Soviet Union. And then he becomes like a very proud student, and he and his family truly believe in communism, and they are devoted to Yiddish culture. So do you think he was ever torn between his identity and the Soviet Union and America?
Well, that's why I thought that Nick Clooney's comment about the personification of the Cold War battle between the workers' paradise and the American dream. I can't answer that question fully because unfortunately I can't interview him. It's too bad we can't have him here tonight. But I can say that he grew up until he graduated from high school when he was 15 years old. He was a star student. He was in National Honor Society, the king of the debate team. He was an actor. in that wonderful theatrical production. Did you read that? It was called Nothing But the Truth. His senior year. But so, he lived, as I say, at one point, he grew up basically in the American dream, but he was, there was always this reel of political darkness, basically, from the time he was born, I think. It was inescapable. His parents had, he grew up in a very idealistic household, which, his parents had left Russia in 1910 and 1911. And by the way, they came through the Ellis Island of the West. I've gotten a lot of emails lately about comments about how people didn't know that there was an Ellis Island of the West, which was Galveston, but his parents came through Galveston and settled in Iowa in 1910, 1911. He grew up in Iowa. They left in 1932. And as you'll see in the book, there is this subtext that runs through Koval's life of anti-Semitism. And some of the details in the 1920s will be rather surprising to most readers, I think. His parents really were very influenced by the fact that anti-Semitism became a crime after in the new Russia, right, in the Soviet Union. And so in 1932, they left America. And there were all kinds of things that happened to Koval in 1929, 30, 31, before he leaves with his parents in 1932. But in the 19th, so I don't want to give a lot away, but that I won't give a lot away right now about what happens to him in the 1930s, et cetera, et cetera. But then he's recruited by the GRU. And I mean, I think that's one of the big questions. Why did he decide to be trained as a Red Army intelligence officer? And I don't think, he probably had much of a choice. I don't think he abandoned his idealism in, the communist ideal. I don't think he did, but at the same time, I think you'll see when you read, as you read through the book, that he was facing all kinds of obstacles every step of the way, and from an idealistic perspective. So when he returned to the Soviet Union in 1948, after 8 years of being a spy here, I'm sure that he was relieved that he got away from here because of all the things that were happening in 1948, including George Kennan's containment policy, et cetera, et cetera. He had to return to the Soviet Union in 48, which he did. And when he did, he was greeted with not a parade thanking him for everything he did, but very intense anti-Semitism and anti-American. It was very anti-American, anti-cosmopolitan, very interesting time in Soviet history. So he was plagued by that. He was surrounded by that prejudice all of his life. Go ahead.
Throughout the book, like this sentiment comes and goes, and it's very latent, and sadly, like we see it today again. So
yes, and that's lessons learned. Like always, after working through a narrative like this and piecing together everything and doing the extensive fact checking, et cetera, then you take a deep breath. What does it mean? What is the significance of this? Why should we know about this spy's life? And, we should understand the motivations that someone like George Koval would have to be a spy. Yes, we have to study that, but you have to understand where those motivations came from. And, that's why that very deep theme in the book is that underlying, ongoing anti-Semitism throughout his life. And, you can't, it's like one of my sources for this said at one point, you can't oppress people without a response, the backlash of bigotry, right? So that's a very interesting part of it that maybe you just don't expect. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned that he was recruited by the Red Army in 1939, and then he's 1 year later sent to America for his business trip, as I recall.
Yeah, right.
But you also reveal that throughout the 30s, so even before he's in America, the FBI already knew about hundreds of Soviet spies in the US. So my question is, what do you think was keeping them from realizing the magnitude of this threat?
Oh, of Koval, why
or
wasn't
like spies in general?
The what?
Or like the threat of so many spies in the US?
Right. Well, I think they were working hard on it, but there was a focus. That's a conversation for another time, perhaps. But kind of a long answer to that. The short answer is that in wartime, the Soviet Union, it was our ally. And so all of the intelligence machinery in America was focused on German spies, but also it was much smaller than it is now. You have to realize that. You have to look at the history of the FBI, the history of intelligence agencies in this country. It's fascinating. And where it was in the 1930s, where it was in the 1940s, what the goals were. And you can see the answer to that. But with Koval, his timing was fairly excellent. No sheer luck, no coincidences, but he happened to be a very astute scientist at a time when we had many wartime projects for which we needed astute scientists. And that, in combination with the fact that he blended in, he had no Russian accent to his English, of course, because he grew up here. And, he blended in on so many different levels. And so there's that. Plus, I think he was a sharp guy. He was well-trained by the GRU. He did not mingle with fellow spies. And he was a dedicated scientist. And so all of those reasons, the focus in this country on spies, German spies, and also the size of the intelligence community at that point, the focus that Hoover had after the war. There are many reasons that you can see, why George Koval was missed. Anyhow, I don't. But also, the history. There are so many domains of background history for the book to bring alive his biography, and one of them that I could have gotten obsessed with. I mean, there's a line in the intro. The notes intro that says this is the kind of topic you get nearly obsessed with, but each of the domains were so fascinating, and each of the areas that really answer the question of what were we missing and what were we finding and why, really, no other word, very, very, very interesting. And you can see how Koval kind of slipped in to the fabric of a timeline in the 1940s of all of these, the need for the scientists, his good training, his ability to blend in. In this day and age, with computers, it wouldn't have worked, because he had an arrest record from 1931. He had been the representative of the Young Communist Party for in a Chicago convention in 1930, all these things, but there was no reason, because he was part of the US Army in several elite groups, and he was a much needed scientist. There was no reason to really suspect him and then to dig in. But at any rate, go ahead.
Okay, next question. So one of the critical establishments you mentioned is Amtorg. So this is a type of chamber of commerce for the Soviet Union that was based in New York, and that also had like quasi-consular functions since there were no diplomatic relations between the US and the Soviet Union back then. So could you tell us about the spying practices of this organization? And since they had like so much access to international corporations that wanted to do business in the Soviet Union. And do you think many organizations like these are still operating similarly in the US?
Oh gosh, Amtorg is utterly fascinating, especially because George Koval's handler was a part of it from the time it was in London. I think it was called Arcos in London, and then in the United States it was Amtorg. And Amtorg was an excellent cover for because it basically we didn't recognize the Soviet Union until 1933, and so our American companies wanted to do business with the Soviet Union, and so until they were recognized and we had consulates across the country, there had to be a way for the exchange of business, basically, so that the Soviets could find out what was happening in American business and invest, buy, and it was Amtorg was the great, well, it was like an embassy. It was a quasi-embassy. The problem lies in the fact that it was also a way for Soviet spies to enter the country and also make contacts and find out, what George was initially assigned to do. His assignment was to find out about our latest chemical weapons, to infiltrate laboratories studying chemical warfare, right? And so that was the kind of information he was supposed to get on his quote unquote business trip here. And that's what was happening with some of the Soviet spies who came through Amtorg, because they were appearing to find out information about what America was making, our manufacturing, our industrial productions, and it was all done with the cover of being business, basically. That's where the concept of the spies coming here on business trips, that's where that came from. But so Amtorg is a very interesting part of the recognition, the years before the United States recognized the Soviet Union in 1933. And it plays a role in the background of George's life, partly because of his handler.
Yeah.
Does that help? Yeah.
Yeah,
And
no,
you-
it's
listen,
fascinating.
I can't answer the question of whether it's happening now because I haven't researched now. So how's that? That's a good answer, right?
Yeah. So going forward in time, so after the bomb is released and is ready, and then there it's dropped in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, President Trump authorizes the release of a report that describes the research, the money allocated, and then the use of atomic energy for military purposes. So this brings like a strong and intense debate on national security versus the public's right to know. Could you please tell us about this controversy and its aftermath?
Oh, right. That was a very fascinating part of the research because after, there was a big debate because General Groves wanted to believed the General Groves we have Robert Oppenheimer and we have General Groves in running the Manhattan Project, and in the Oppenheimer was the chief scientist and Groves was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers head of it, and there was a big debate about what should be known to the world. And so Groves' concept, and he defended it in a Saturday Evening Post article. It was a very intense article, quoted in the book. He definitely believed that if the American people would demand to know what the process had been to create this. So he devised there's a wonderful quote. If we had more time, I'd find it from Groves.
I have a summary because I think it's wonderful. So
yeah, it's really, will you say that? Because that is really wonderful. I mean, he let some things go and he kept something secret. And so do you see that quote?
I summarized it a little bit. So he basically makes this public statement. Keeping a project of such importance secret could happen in a totalitarian state, but not in America, where freedom of the press is one of our basic concepts. And he also mentions that no government official has the right ever to refuse to tell Congress what he has done with $2 billion.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Public money. So that was.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you found that and liked that. I'm really glad I included it because it's just so. The other thing that's fascinating about that is that the report, it was called the Smith Report, SMYTH, and it had nothing in it. It only had the chemistry in it. It had nothing, none of the metallurgy, or it only had the physics in it. It didn't have any of the chemistry, and so it didn't have polonium in it. And the polonium, which is a part of the George Koval story, a very interesting part, remained a secret for a long time because that was one of the secrets that was not released in the Smith Report. What was happening in terms of polonium was the fuel for the trigger, and they were not releasing the details of that. And so that's one of the reasons that the polonium was something that, the world didn't learn about. They learned about plutonium and uranium, but not polonium, because there was a sifting of details in the Smith Report. It's fascinating. Yeah.
And I admire your ability to explain all this chemistry and amounts. Like I learned so much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was a fascinating process. I have to say I was overwhelmed when one of the research librarians who was helping me with that part of it discovered a 450-page technical report from 1956 that explained exactly the sources of the natural source of polonium and the process of manufacturing polonium and why it was so important for the trigger, all of those details. I read all 450 pages, and that was a challenge, but I learned so much. At the end of the book, I thought, oh my gosh, I feel like returning and getting an advanced degree in nuclear physics or something. But I had several sources for the fact checking, and also a couple tutorials that I asked for from two nuclear physicists who are exceptionally bright, but it's just so interesting. I mean, you know, everything from the Oak Ridge history to the Dayton history to just all parts of the Manhattan Project should be required reading for, you know, American students, because you learn so much, not just about science, but government and determination and, you know, the will to succeed. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and also there's a lot of international cooperation, because like Canada and Great Britain were also part of this project.
Right.
So a few questions of mine before we go to the audience. So you mentioned an incredible spy who penetrates the deepest layers of trust and security around the same time in Canada. So this is Fred Rose. Can you briefly tell us his story?
Oh dear. Oh, Fred Rose. Oh dear. Well, let's see. That would have happened in, there was a defection. And that is in the timeline shortly after the end of the war and the bomb going off, the two bombs. We have the situation in Canada where there is a defection, and actually that was a major turning point, I think, for Soviet espionage in the United States at that point. In fact, because of the defection, and Fred Rose was in Parliament, in the Canadian Parliament, and had been a mole for quite a while. In fact, it's very possible that George Koval's false passport that he came in on in the 1940s came through with some help from there. But anyhow, there were connections between the Canadian Soviet spies working in Canada and working in the United States. And there was a defector in, I think it was September 1945, major turning point. And it actually led to the end of one of the Soviet consul's careers, a gentleman working in the New York consulate on East 60th Street. He left in December. So various parts of George Koval's connections were terribly affected and threatened by the defection that occurred in Canada, and including Fred Rose. Those people were connected indirectly, directly to a few people who were indirectly connected to George Koval. So it was a big threat. And after the war, he was actually offered an excellent job to continue his work as a health physicist, but he knew that the security the security investigations that would occur after he did that would endanger him. And so he kept a very low profile, starting once he was demobilized from the U.S. Army, which would have been in February 1946. But that period of time from September 1945 on into the spring of 1946 is fascinating in terms of the Soviet espionage threads in Canada and the ties to what was happening in America, especially New York.
Yeah.
Mm.
And yeah, and as you say, like since some spies were uncovered during that time, Koval makes his great escape back to Moscow in 1948.
Right.
However, and during this time, like the FBI uncovers more and more spies, but it takes the FBI and the CIA almost 6 years to begin official hunt and start interviewing people. So how could this happen, and how could it take so long for them to realize who he was?
Yes, well, that's the ultimate question, I suppose, and I hope the book kind of shows that, because the way they finally uncovered his work, some of it anyhow, was when his cover shop, they went through all kinds of, the FBI went through all kinds, I think it was in July 1954, that he was discovered. It was one of those, remember I said aha moments? I'm sure it was for the intelligence group trying to explore Raven Electric company, which was the main cover shop for Koval's handler, who was very involved in the Soviet espionage network in New York. And so that he owned that, the FBI, to make a very long story very short, it went through records at the attorney's office where the bankruptcy of Raven Electric was handled, and they were matching names of employees with wartime projects, and the match of George and the Manhattan Project occurred. So, and why so long? Well, it's, he got away. That's the simplest answer. And like what I said before, there are reasons that he did. Part of it, his own expertise. I mean, you have to give him credit for that, but also the fact that the U.S. Army was a great cover for him, and there were security checks, huge numbers of security checks, of course, but only for what the applications he had filled out. And, and in the applications he had filled out, he had never returned to the Soviet Union in 1932. He had lived in Iowa until 1936. I think that's what his application said. And then he moved to New York. And he had all these different jobs. Those details were never checked, obviously. And why would they have been? That's the thing, because he tested highly to enter the Army's specialized training program, and then the special engineer detachment program, and he became a health physicist. He was basically undercover with the U.S. Army. Where he ran into dangerous times was after, like I said before, he was demobilized in February of 1946. And then he had to keep a very low profile, and he did that by being a joiner, blending in so well, being part of an honorary fraternity of electrical engineers, and joining a bowling league. So, and then, he returns, we're skipping in past many details, but he returns in 1948, and the focus on Soviet espionage is in other, there's a line in the book, I think Hoover was hunting in the wrong territory, so there was no reason to be investigating George Koval. There was no reason to until that the Raven Electric. Now there was a big reason to be investigating Raven Electric because of the handler. And because if you see the timeline in the, I think they're like 3,000 pages for the handler, but if you see the timelines of these individuals, when they left America, what they did, and when they were, their work was discovered, then you can see how, you know, he was missed, basically. And you have to read the book.
There are many details and many stories that really make you wonder how could this happen. One more question. This one comes from Michael. He asks, did Koval had any knowledge of the work of atomic spies Klaus Fuchs and Ted Hall, or any contact with either of them after the war?
Oh, after the war, not that I know of. No evidence of that. I mean, the timelines of Ted Hall and Klaus Fuchs and George Koval are fascinating, really fascinating. But when they were doing their work, but after the war, no evidence. A close friend of George Koval's had a meeting with Ted Hall in the 1990s at some point, but not George.
Okay. And last question, this one comes from Lauren. Can you tell us about his post-mortem decorations by President Putin in 2007?
Oh, well, yes. He received the Hero of the Federation award posthumously. And there are details, the epilogue tells those details. Yeah, so you can read that in the epilogue. I can't recall all of the details at the moment.
And then this question comes from Phoebe. It's more of a yes or no question. She says, the creation of the atomic and nuclear bombs resulted from arduous, expensive, and lengthy collaborations between the US, Canada, and the UK. Would the Soviets be able to achieve the same without their spies?
Oh, well, that's actually discussed in the book because of Kurchatov, Igor Kurchatov, who was the head scientist, an article that he wrote later, and go into some detail because that is a very, very fascinating question. And you know, I think his belief was that there would have been a Soviet atomic bomb no matter what, but because there was the scientific capability, but what was sent to them speeded things up because they didn't have to go through all of the experimentation. You know, when you read about how long it took to figure out how to produce the largest amount of polonium, you can see what sending the recipe to polonium, how much time was cut from that. So yes, the Soviet atomic bomb occurred because of scientists in the Soviet Union, but also it was speeded up quite, you know, there are different theories about how much because of the details that were sent to them by spies in this country, Canada and England. So yes, it definitely speeded things up. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And but the discussion of that is rather interesting, I think. In the book, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So, thank you, Anne. Again, congratulations. This was wonderful and very illustrative. So we wish you all the best. Thank you, all of us, for joining us. Check the website for upcoming programs and see you soon.
Thank you. Yeah.